So as some of you know, yesterday was the 25th anniversary of my first visit to Northeast India. And that's a really rather special event for me because I've spent a lot of time studying the languages of Northeast India over the last 25 years. And I thought it might be nice to reminisce, if you like, on some of the events that happened way back at that time. So I've called this 25 years of language research in Northeast India, but in fact today I'm only going to talk about the very first visit that I made to Northeast India in October 1997. Now it started way back in October. Well, actually it really started much earlier in the year. I had gone to Thailand to study Thai language, the Bangkok Thai language, at a university in southern Thailand. And my teacher, Dr. Thananan, when he came to know that my wife and I were going to have a holiday in India, he said, why don't you travel to Northeast India? Why don't you travel to Assam? There are Thai people living in Assam state and you can go and visit them. And I thought, no, that can't be. I had read that in fact it was very difficult for foreigners to travel to Assam, and it had been difficult for foreigners to travel to Assam. But by the time that this was happening, by 1996, it was possible to travel there. So when my wife and I arrived in Kolkata, we were able to go to Assam House, get the information from them about what was required, buy a ticket to travel to Assam, and therefore actually travel to Assam. And we arrived early in the morning on the 17th of October, 1996. We went pretty much straight away to a very cheap hotel in Paltan Bazaar and probably got some breakfast, settled into the hotel, wandered a little bit around Paltan Bazaar, and then worked out how to go across the bridge, across the Latokia Bridge to Laktokia Bridge to Pan Bazaar, where we met up with Nobin Sham. So this was, I think, the very first photo that I took in Northeast India back in October of 1996. And this is, as many of you will know, the Department of Historical and Antiquarian Studies. That's the post office building behind it. And basically, when I had been in Thailand, my teacher, Dr. Thananan, he recommended me to visit another professor, Professor Chatip, who was living at that time in Bangkok and who had been to visit Assam. And Professor Chatip gave me three names. And the first name was Professor Jogin Phukon. The second name was Yehom Buragohain. But the third name was Nobin Sham. And when we got to the Department of Historical and Antiquarian Studies, we found that Yehom and Professor Jogin Phukon had gone to Thailand to a conference. I had known about this conference, but I decided not to go to it because I thought it'd be more interesting to travel to India. And so only Nobin was there. And it was on that day, 17th of October, that we first met Nobin. Well, a few days later, Nobin invited us to visit his house on Housing Hill. Now, this is a photo that I took of Housing Hill that day. I think it would have been maybe 1 or 2 days later. And we visited for the first time Nobin's family. And here's a photo of my wife on the left and Nobin on the right, and Nobin's wife and other members of his families, some of his children and some of his other relatives. There's Nang Wimala also looking very directly at the camera. And that photo was taken on our very first day. That was the first time that we had a traditional Thai meal in a Thai village. It was a really exciting thing for us because we hadn't before had the chance to meet with Thai people and experience the way that they were living in their houses and in their villages. Okay, so here's a few photos that I took on that day. And on the left-hand side, this is a long photo that we took. It's actually two photos that I stuck together of the kitchen, because this was the first time that I'd seen anything like this. In Australia, we do not have kitchens like this. You can see the fireplace down the bottom where the cooking is done and the various shelves above it where things were stored, oils and some of the vegetables and some of the cooking pots and some of the baskets. And in the middle, there's a photo of Imu, that's Nobin's wife, and two of her children. And on the right-hand side, this was a photo of the small area in front of Nobin's house. It's only about maybe 2 meters or perhaps 3 meters wide, directly in front of the house before there's a slope downwards. And that's where the family can gather outside of the house. On the way back from visiting Nobin's house on that day, he took us to visit the Navograha temple. And here you can see photos of the Navograha temple, which I took also on that very first day. And this, of course, was the first time that we had seen any one of the ancient, if you like, monuments of Assam. Very beautiful temple, quite stunning. Never seen anything like this before. But another thing that Nobin did, either that same afternoon, I think it was a Saturday, or possibly the next day, he took us to visit a home family. And this is the family of Professor Sondro Borua. That's him standing on the left, and his wife, also a professor at Cotton College, if my memory serves me right, and her son and daughter, who were unmarried at the time. That's 25 years ago, after all. And Professor Borua's mother, who has now passed away, who is sitting there. And so we had the chance to visit the beautiful garden of Professor Borua's house in Senikuti. Senikuti, we came to learn, was the name of a bus stop on the road. And because later, as you'll hear, we came to stay there. These are some photos that I took on that day of Professor Borua's house. One of these very fine traditional Assamese houses, which has been very nicely preserved and is a really beautiful example of traditional Assamese houses. And Professor Borua came to know that we were planning to visit Upper Assam, because Nobin, it turned out by luck, was traveling back to his home village just a few days later. And he said, why don't you come too? And when we told this to Professor Borua, he said, I have a friend in Upper Assam, that is Otul Borgohain. I will telephone him and suggest that when you reach to Dibrugarh, to Upper Assam, he can take care and look after you. And so, so that was arranged. And Professor Borua took us to visit a number of his friends. And the reason why I've included this photo is that I think this was the first time that we were presented with gamusa. As you can see, my wife and I, this is with Mr. Borpatra Gohain. It's a long time ago, this photo. And this, I think, was the very first gamusa that my wife and I were ever presented with. And you can see that we are wearing these gamusa. That short sleeve shirt, that's a synthetic shirt, which I bought in Thailand, I used for many, many years during hot seasons in visits to Assam. It was made out of that synthetic material and it lasted for a long time. So I remember that Professor Borua and Mrs. Borua went and took us to visit many families, and also took us up to Kamakhya temple, from where we were able to take I think this must be from Kamakya Temple, or maybe this is from Nabograha, I'm not sure, take photos of the beautiful Brahmaputra River at Guwahati. Well, as I mentioned before, Nobin was traveling back to his home village just 2 or 3 days after we arrived in Assam. This was something we had no expectation would happen. I don't think we'd have been able to find our own way to the village if he had not been traveling. And if he had not been traveling, perhaps we would never have visited the Aiton villages in Golagat and Karbi Anglong district. And how lucky we were that he was traveling at that time. So we said to him, how will we travel? And he said, well, we'll get a bus ticket. So we said, well, okay, can we book it? Can we go and organize the ticket? Oh no, he said, you buy the bus ticket on the afternoon of the day before you travel. And we thought, how can this be? I mean, if you cannot book the ticket in advance, will you miss out on a seat? He said, don't worry, don't worry. And so on the afternoon of the day before we were traveling, I think we were traveling on a Monday. So we went on the Sunday afternoon to the office in Paltan Bazaar to buy the tickets. Following morning early, we appeared with our bags at the agreed time. I think it was around 8 or 15 minutes before 8, and Nobin also came. And we got onto the bus and started the journey to Upper Assam. Now, I don't have any photos of the journey, but what I remember particularly is the first time that I saw a tea estate. And thinking, what are these plants that are growing in this curious way on slightly hilly areas, slightly raised up above the rice fields, and these very carefully manicured almost plants that are just growing in such large numbers. And I also remember that we stopped, I think it was Jakalabanda, for a lunch, and that this was done at one of those hotels where you could stop and everything was provided. You simply paid a single fee and they kept bringing food and more food and more food. This was the first time we experienced that. But in the afternoon of that day, we arrived at Silonijan, and then Nobin arranged for an auto to take us to the village of Banlung, or Borpata in Assamese, and we stayed in this house, the house belonging to Chao Enlai and Nobin's nephew, this beautiful traditional house. And my wife and I, we slept in the room which is on the right-hand side. You'll see also that there is the head of a buffalo at the doorway there. This is a really beautiful traditional house. And here's a photo of Nobin with the owner of the house, Chao Enlai, and with Nobin's sister, which was Nobin's sister-in-law, which was Chao Enlai's mother, and also my wife. This was taken probably on the next morning after we arrived there. This was also the first occasion that we got to see a traditional loom and traditional bamboo style houses. I don't know if this particular house is still standing because bamboo houses don't last for that long and have to be rebuilt. But this was a real special thing for us to see. And even more special was the outside bathrooms of this type, which we don't have something like this exactly in Australia. Actually, at that time, my wife and I did have an outside latrine, at least, at our house, but it was only about 1 meter from the house. And if it was cold and raining, we could just simply jump in at night. But this one and the bathroom was something very different for us, and also the style of bathing. So inside there, as many of you would know, there is a concrete tank full of water. And when we would take our baths, goodness me, that water would be cold. Here in Australia, we're used to the showering style. And another thing that this house had was a spirit house, which was built in bamboo on the edge of the house where the members of the house would pray in the morning. And this was something which I was very keen to take photos of. Well, it turned out that the reason why Nobin was traveling to Assam at that time was to attend a meeting where the new Khamti script, or the reformed Khamti script, that had been created by Jalkuk Manpung was to be discussed. And so I attended that meeting. This is a photo. There you can see me on the, sorry, I'll just go back one. There you can see me on the right-hand side with Nobin and with some other people. And I attended that meeting and listened carefully to what Jalkuk Manpung was telling. Here's a photo of my wife with some of the women who attended the meeting. Those young girls will be grown up and married with girls of their own by now, I suppose. Here's another photo that was taken outside. Again, this is 25 years ago. And the temple at, this is actually in the village of Banhin, Silonijan, where the meeting was held. And I had to include this photo because this is the Borpatar, or the big rice field, and that's the village of Banlong behind it. And because this was October, the rice is still green and extremely beautiful to look at. So we stayed in that Aiton village, I think only for 2 nights. We arrived, we stayed one night, the next day was the meeting, we stayed that night, and the next morning turned out that Jalkuk Manpung was traveling back to his home in the Kamti area and would be passing by Dibrugarh and would be able to drop us at Otul Borgohain's house. So there is Otul Borgohain on the left-hand side, Jalkuk Manpung standing next to me, and 2 of the people who accompanied him, whose names I'm afraid I have forgotten, standing between us. So we traveled by car. We traveled through Sipsagar. I remembered we stopped in Sipsagar town very briefly for some lunch. We reached Dibrugarh in the afternoon as the sun was beginning to get low. You can see that the sun is already somewhat low, and it would have been several hours more before Jalkuk Manpung reached his home. And I think it was a bit of an inconvenience for him to take us, but this gave us the opportunity to arrive safely in Dibrugarh, since we would not have been easily able to work out how to use the buses. And this is a photo of my wife taken with Otul Borgohain's family, with his daughter, with his son, who was known to me as Raj. He passed away some years ago in a very unfortunate accident in Kashmir, caught in a flash flood. And this was a photo that I took staying with their family. Actually, we were not staying in the house because all the rooms were full, because both their son and daughter were visiting from outside, but they arranged for us to stay in a nice hotel in the center of Dibrugarh town, and that gave us a chance to walk around the town and get to know things a little bit. Otul Borgohain arranged for us to go on a visit to see some of the main sites of the Tayahom, but along the way we passed by a tea estate. And so I asked if we could stop so that I could take a photo, because we don't have tea estates like this in Australia, or at least I had never seen one. And this was a special thing to see. On that day, we visited Soraidiao, we visited all of the major sites of the Tayahom. And this, one of the Moidams, we visited there. We also saw some of the other Moidams and the very attractive gardens that have now been planted around them. And I remember in particular that Otul Borgohain had with him one of his friends, a very dear man, the late Dimba Rajpwan. Some of you will know his name. Some of you will know the circumstances in which he died, which is very sad. And I remember, though, that he gave us some great assistance because we later needed to catch a bus back to Guwahati, and he helped to arrange that since he was involved with the bus services in Dibrugarh. So we managed to visit all of the major sites of the Tayahom that we could visit in one day. Here is Gorgaon, you will recognize. Here is a photo of me with Dimba Rajpwan, the late Dimba Rajpwan, and Otul Borgohain, and another photo of Otul Borgohain at the beautiful palace of Gorgaon. And here's a photo that I took right from the top of looking down on my wife as she got up near to the top of the palace. So a couple of days later, I said to Otur Borgohain that what I wanted to do was to research the Thai home language. And he said to me, don't. He said, first you need to learn to speak Thai language. This was very good advice. And so what we did a couple of days later is that he took me and my wife and our luggage in a car to Nampake village. We arrived in the village and we sat in the temple, and he had spoken, I think, to the monk, the venerable monk, who is still there. And the venerable monk called one of the villagers who was very good in English language. This was Aituante, and asked if we could stay in his house because he was a good speaker of English. And this was a photograph of his old house, which has now been destroyed by the erosion caused by the Dihing River. But at that time, it stood like this. We used to walk to that house along the edge of the river and passing through these wonderful traditional gates. We had never seen anything like this in Australia either, these traditional bamboo gates where you would pull the bamboos out and then walk through and then push them back again. Various other things we saw in that house. We happened to be there at a time when they were replacing some of the floors. And so we saw the way in which the bamboos were cut to prepare for the flooring, and also, of course, on the right-hand side, the traditional loom. But we were even more fortunate. I can't tell you how fortunate we were on this first trip to Assam, because it happened to correspond with the Boi Okwa, which was the traditional ceremony for the ending of the Buddhist rains retreat. And so this was a day when the whole village would gather in the temple for prayers and for village events afterwards. So they loaned my wife and I proper clothing, and you can see there my wife is dressed in the traditional Thai pake clothes, with Yenotan, the eldest daughter of that family, on the left-hand side, and also holding the beautiful flowers which would be taken to the temple. And there's a photo of me as well, with one of those very fine, beautiful Thai pake bags, and I can assure you we continue to use those bags regularly, getting ready to go to the Boi Okwa, the ceremony, the prayer of that day. And here's some photos in the temple. Now, subsequently, of course, I have purchased recording devices, and I have also purchased cameras so that I have filmed events like this. But on that day, we didn't have those. So we only have these still photos. But I still think this is a beautiful photo showing the candles, showing the ladies with their flowers and their incense in their hands, and all the beautiful sounds of the prayers. The men are sitting to the left and the younger people will be sitting more to the right. Here's another photo of the same. Afterwards, there was a lot of opportunity to go and visit different houses. I can't remember how many houses we went to visit on that day, but let's say a lot. And in every house, we would drink a cup of tea and eat some biscuits and drink maybe another cup of tea. And so one of the houses we visited was the house of the family of the late Aimyachain Gohain, who you see here with his daughter and 4 granddaughters. Later, I can remember a meal that we had in his house with all the granddaughters, giving us food from every direction, standing around us as we ate and placing more food on our plate. We also visited the house of Inyan Ket and met for the first time Pemti Gohain, who is standing next to me there. As you can see, I got used to wearing the traditional lungi, which I still always wear when I go to the villages. And this was also a chance for my wife and I to learn about traditional bathing and traditional clothes washing. So I included these two photos, which you may laugh about because we had never done bathing quite in this way, and certainly never done clothes washing in the river in this way. It was a new experience for us both. We left the village of Nampake on a morning that was slightly raining, but before we left the village, I had noticed in the village that there were traditional manuscripts. And I asked the people if there would be any value in being able to type the manuscripts using a computer. I didn't have my laptop with me on that village. I'd left it behind in Thailand, didn't want to carry it around India. It was a long time ago. It was a different era. But I had learned the skill of making fonts, and I asked the people if there would be some value in making what I called a computer printing block for the Thai scripts. And they said, yes, it would. And so we gathered together a meeting in the temple, and we don't have any photos of this, but assisted by Aitwonje, who is standing there second from the left, we all went to the temple in the morning that we were leaving to go back to Dibrugarh. And I sat with the elders in the village and we discussed how the font should be made. And many of you will know that the Thai font was made later in that year. Actually, it was probably 1997 before I made it, and has been used ever since. And this was the beginning, if you like, of my research. I had tried to make a few recordings, both in the Aidon village and also in the Pake village, of how the language sounds, but I was not really very skillful in doing this at the time. But the one thing which I could do was to make the font. So I went back to Australia with the copy of one manuscript, which was given me to help with that process, and some ideas of the shapes of the scripts that people wanted. So we traveled back to Dibrugarh, and a few days later, we got a bus back to Guwahati. There is one more story that I will tell to complete this discussion. When we reached Guwahati, we had not made a booking in a hotel because it had been so easy to get one when we arrived in Guwahati the first time. But my wife and I, we are not followers of sports. We're not followers of cricket. So we didn't know that the Australian cricket team was coming to play, I think it may have been South Africa, in a cricket match in Guwahati that very day that we were, or the next day after we were arriving back in Guwahati. So when we got to Guwahati, there was not any room in the inn. As those of you who know some of the traditional Christian stories will have heard this before, there was no room in the inn. We could not find a hotel room anywhere. And so we began to think, what can we do about this? We are foreign visitors. We have arrived at night. It was already like 6 o'clock and dark. We visited every hotel that we could find. And eventually, the only thing that we could do was to ring up Professor C.K. Burua and ask him for help. And he said, stay where you are, we'll come and get you. And so we were brought back to Professor Burua's house and invited to stay there until we could resume our journey to visit the rest of India. So lucky were we that, that we could do that. I remember one thing more that I will share with you, and that is when we visited the Buruas, they said that they would give us dinner, what was described by Mrs. Burua as a simple khana. And it was already 6 or so, and they gave us some afternoon tea when we arrived there. And we thought, okay, a simple khana, by 7 or 7:30, we will get something to eat. 7:30 came, no. 8 o'clock came, no. 8:30 came, no. 9 o'clock came, no. Because this was the first time that we had eaten an evening meal in a traditional Assamese house. And people in Assamese houses, especially in towns, eat very late. This was quite something for us to learn. Anyway, I shall stop here. My first recollection of visits to Assam in 1996.